Hello everyone, we continue with DPU, the second member of the family. DPU, delivered at place unloaded. The definition is delivered unloaded at the named destination. Disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer and lessons given are not legal advice. I'm just sharing my professional knowledge and experiences earned over 2 decades. The codes we use from the Incoterms 2020 book are all the intellectual property of ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, whom I thank for their effort and perseverance in updating and revising the terms and also permitting us to use the codes. Here you see the diagram of DPU. As you can see, everything is the same with DAP, but the unloading stage, which is on the seller in this case. As we said before, we can use this term for all modes of transport and combined shipment. While in combined shipment, some problems may emerge, and it is not advised for combined shipment, but it is usable. Under DPU, the seller is generally responsible for export packing, loading charges, delivery, export duties and taxes, original terminal charges, loading on the carriage charges, and destination terminal charges. The buyer then is generally responsible for the delivery to the destination and import duties and taxes. A1. General obligations. In each of the 11 rules, the seller must provide the goods and their commercial invoices as required by the contract of sale and any other evidence of conformity, such as an analysis certificate or weighbridge document, etc., that might be relevant and specified in the contract. Each of the rules also provides that any document can be in paper or electronic form as agreed in the contract, or if the contract makes no mention of this, then as is customary. The rules do not define what electronic form is. It can be anything from a PDF file to blockchain or some format yet to be developed in the future. B1. General obligations. In each of the rules, the buyer must pay the price for the goods as stated in the contract of sale. The rules do not refer to when the payment is to be made: before shipment, immediately after shipment, 30 days after shipment, half now and half later, or whatever, or how it is to be paid, prepayment, against an email of copy documents or presentation of documents to a bank under a letter of credit, or other arrangements. These matters should be specified in the contract. A2. Delivery. The DAP and DDP rules require the seller to take an almost the maximum responsibility of placing the goods at the disposal of the buyer at the agreed destination place or point within that place, but not unloaded from the arriving means of transport. This usually would be a truck, but could be a train, a barge, or even ship, and unlikely though, it might be a chartered aircraft. The DPU rule goes one step further, requiring the seller to unload the goods from the arriving means of transport. DPU is the old DAT rule, but expanded to mean any place to avoid misunderstanding of the 2010 rule, where many took it literally from its title to just mean a terminal, even though it meant anywhere from an open field to a covered warehouse, including the buyer's warehouse. A common mistake with DAP and DDP especially is the reverse of the misunderstanding with the old DAT, to believe that the destination will always be the buyer's premises. But this needs not to be the case. The buyer could nominate, say, the site of a new factory they are building for their client. It could be the container terminal in the destination country or somewhere else. If it is the buyer's premises or a site they have nominated, then they usually would have the equipment on hand to unload the goods. But sometimes the truck will have a crane mounted on it, or even a forklift trucked into the rear of it. Or the goods are so specialized that the seller would need to also provide the equipment to unload the goods, making it DPU. If the destination is a terminal, then it would be usual that the seller's carrier would unload the means of transport or arrange for that unloading, such as the container from the truck delivering it from the quay, the goods from the chartered aircraft, and so on, again making it DPU, not DAP. The delivery must be made on the agreed date or within the agreed period. B2. Delivery. The buyer's obligation is to take delivery when the goods have been delivered as described in A2. A3. Transfer of risk. In all the rules, the seller bears all risks of loss or damage to the goods until they have been delivered in accordance with A2 described above. The exception is loss or damage in circumstances described in B3 below, which varies dependent on the buyer's role in B2. B3. Transfer of risk. The buyer bears all risks of loss or damage to the goods once the seller has delivered them as described in A2. If the buyer fails to inform the seller exactly to where it is to deliver the goods, or if the buyer fails to import clear the goods, then it bears the risk of loss or damage to the goods from the agreed date or agreed period of delivery. For example, if the seller dispatches the goods to the buyer and they are held indefinitely by the importing country's authorities because the buyer failed to obtain the necessary import permit, then the buyer bears the risk. A4. Carriage. The seller must arrange a contract for carriage to the named place of destination, and if there is an agreed point within that destination, then to that point. Cost of this carriage is for the seller. As the seller has to arrange the carriage, it needs to know from the buyer if there is a specific point in the place of delivery to which the goods must be transported. For example, if the destination is shown as simply as Budapest, Hungary, where in that large metropolis is the seller's carrier to leave the goods, it could be that it is to be the buyer's premises or a particular location, say in an empty building site, or the carrier's premises, or the airport, or the container yard, or a particular quay on the river. The exact point should be agreed upon. If it is not, then it is the seller's choice to select the point that best suits its purpose, usually being the cheapest option such as a cargo terminal. For DAP and DDP, if the delivery at the destination is to occur after the buyer completes any necessary import formalities, then the cost of storage due to delays in those formalities being completed is for the buyer, always assuming the seller has provided the buyer with necessary documents in time. For DDP, it is the seller who bears the cost of any storage due to delays in import clearance. B4. Carriage. The buyer has no obligation to the seller to arrange a contract of carriage. A5. Insurance. Despite the seller having the risk of loss or damage to the goods up to the delivery point, the seller does not have an obligation to the buyer to insure the goods. B4. Insurance. Because the seller has the risk of loss or damage to the goods up to the delivery point, the buyer does not have an obligation to the seller to insure the goods. A6. Delivery transport documents. The seller at its own cost must provide the buyer with any documents the buyer needs to take over the goods. What form this document takes will depend on agreement in the contract and might simply be in the form of a receipt which the buyer is to sign. However, it might, in the case of DAP and DPU, where the buyer must import clear the goods, be a copy of the seller's transport document to evidence the export and the date of shipment. B6. Delivery transport document. The buyer must accept the document provided in A6 as it actually takes no part in the transport process. A7. Export-import clearance. Where applicable, the seller must at its risk and expense carry out all export clearance formalities required by the country of export, such as licenses or permits, security clearance for export, pre-shipment inspection, and any other authorizations or approvals. Additionally, as the point of delivery in these rules is in the important country, the seller must also carry out and pay for any formalities required by any country of transit before that delivery occurs. The seller has no obligation to arrange any import clearances. However, if the buyer requests at its own risk and cost, the seller must assist in obtaining any documents and/or information which relate to formalities required by the country of import, such as permits or licenses, security clearance for import, pre-shipment inspection required by the import authorities, and any other official authorizations or approvals. B7. Export-import clearance. Where applicable, the buyer must assist the seller at the seller's request, risk and cost, in obtaining any documents and or information needed for all export-related formalities required by the country of export, as well as any formalities required by any country of transit. Where applicable, the buyer must carry out and pay for all formalities required by the country of import. These include licenses and permits required for import, import clearance, security clearance for transit and import, pre-shipment inspection, and any other official authorizations and approvals. A8. Checking, packaging, marking. In all rules, the seller must pay the costs of any checking operations which are necessary for delivering the goods, such as checking quality, measuring the goods and or packaging, weighing, counting the goods and or packaging. The seller must also package the goods at its own cost unless it is usual for the trade of the goods that they are sold unpackaged, such as in the case of bulk goods. The seller must also take into account the transport of the goods and package them appropriately unless the parties have agreed in their contract that the goods be packaged and or marked in a specific manner. B8. Checking, packaging, marking. In all rules, there is no obligation from the buyer to the seller as regards packaging and marking. There can in practice, however, be agreed exceptions, such as when the buyer provides the seller with labels, logos, or similar. A9 and B9. Allocation of costs. The only difference between DAP and DPU is that the seller pays for the unloading of the goods. Points to keep in mind. All points are almost the same as DAP, and the only difference is the unloading part, which is on the seller this time. 1. This term is a bad choice for a letter of credit. As I told you before, this is a bad choice for a letter of credit from the point of view of the seller. 2. The Incoterm rules skip when title passes from seller to buyer. This needs to be defined separately in the sales contract. 3. Here we have a problem we had in Xworks. As the seller is to unload the goods from the truck or the container, then they will need a forklift, labor, blah blah. The seller may require their ID, insurance status, which may cause difficulty and delay. I would choose DAP instead unless the nature of the merchandise required DPU. Something more which I have to mention here is the risk in unloading. Imagine the seller has no equipment for unloading the goods at the point of delivery, and the buyer is kind enough to prepare the equipment needed for this. Then, since the risk of the damage to the goods in unloading is on the seller, so the seller has to be confident in the quality of the equipment the buyer provides for unloading. I mean, while the risk is on the seller, the unloading will be done by the buyer, and here is the place where the risk is on you and the products are under control of the buyer.